I was wondering what we were going to uncover. And am I ready to gain that knowledge of what really happened to Dru? Because as the minutes ticked on, that feeling in my gut just got bigger and bigger.
You were full of dread.
It began with a phone call. A bright November afternoon, a young woman walking to her car, chatting with her boyfriend about a purse she'd just bought for her mother. Then suddenly her voice changed. Okay, okay. A pause, then a sharp gasp, oh my God. And then, that was the last time anyone heard Dru Sjodin's voice. What followed was a nightmare that would unfold across frozen fields, cell towers, and crime scenes. It would pull in thousands of volunteers, make headlines across the country, and test the limits of a grieving family's strength. But before the horror, before the headlines and vigils and desperate searches, there was just Dru, and Dru was extraordinary. She was 22 years old, a senior at the University of North Dakota, majoring in graphic design. Her world was filled with color, creativity, and purpose. Known for her kindness as much as her art, Dru juggled 2 part-time jobs, volunteered with children, and belonged to the Gamma Phi Beta sorority. She had the kind of energy that seemed endless, the kind of light people remembered years later. Her friends called her Doodles because she was always sketching something on napkins, on notebooks, even on her own hands. Her stepfather once said, "Where I saw a blank wall, she saw a story." But her generosity ran deeper than creativity. She gave her time freely, offered help without being asked, and made strangers feel like they belonged. Her brother remembered when Dru was 14, a new student came to their school, alone and nervous. Dru was the first to speak to her, and that one act of kindness turned into a lifelong friendship. She loved movement volleyball, basketball, golf, but where she truly came alive was behind a camera, or with a pencil in hand, or designing something beautiful from nothing. Dru didn't live a quiet life. She lived a meaningful one. And that's what made her disappearance so devastating. Because when someone like Dru goes missing, it isn't just about the tragedy of a life interrupted. It's the brutal, incomprehensible loss of a person who made the world just a little better simply by being in it. The mall was starting to empty. It was just after 5 p.m. on November 22, 2003, and the sun had already slipped beneath the horizon, leaving Grand Forks in a dim, wintry twilight. Dru Sjodin had just finished her shift at Victoria's Secret inside the Columbia Mall. Her feet hurt, the wind was biting, and she had another job shift to get to later that night. Still, there was a quiet joy in her voice as she dialed her boyfriend, Chris Lang. She'd found a purse for her mom, a sweet, thoughtful gift, and managed to use both a discount and a gift card. Typical Dru, always thoughtful, always finding joy in the small wins. She stayed on the line as she walked toward her red car in the parking lot. Then, in the middle of her sentence, something shifted. Okay, okay. Chris barely had time to process it before he heard her say, "Oh my God." The line cut off. He assumed it was bad reception. A glitch. She had to get to her next job anyway, and he was busy lifting boxes. Life, as it often does, moved forward until it didn't. That second phone call came at 7:45 p.m., but it wasn't Dru. Static, wind, the sound of buttons being pressed random, frantic. Then nothing. Chris called her roommate Meg. She hadn't come home. He called the bar where Dru was supposed to work. She never arrived. The clock passed 11 p.m. Still no sign of her. It was bitterly cold now, snow beginning to dust the roads. And suddenly, what started as a strange phone call became a terrifying silence. They called the police. Here's something people don't talk about enough when a young woman goes missing. There's always that dreadful gray area between she's probably fine and something's terribly wrong. That limbo, the hours before urgency is taken seriously, can be fatal. And yet Dru's case moved quickly. Her boyfriend and roommate sounded the alarm early. Police responded. There was no delay. But still, it wouldn't be enough. Because sometimes evil is fast. Officers arrived at the Columbia Mall parking lot that night. By then, most cars were gone. The lot was eerily still. Dru's red car stood alone, silent, waiting. The last trace of her routine life. The doors were locked. Her newly bought purse was still inside. Her wallet with cash and credit cards untouched. To a stranger, it might have looked like a young woman had just forgotten to come back. But to those who knew Dru, that was impossible. And then, near the back left tire, they found something chilling. A black sheath, the kind that holds a knife. Let that sink in. Her wallet hadn't been stolen. No window was broken. No signs of forced entry. Nothing was smashed or vandalized. Her car didn't scream robbery. It whispered something far more disturbing. She didn't disappear because of a random crime of opportunity. This wasn't someone looking for money. This was someone looking for her. It's a terrifying realization that violence isn't always chaotic. Sometimes it's calculated. Clean, cold, a predator waiting for a specific moment, and Dru, without knowing it, walked right into it. We like to believe we'd sense danger, that our instincts would scream at us, but sometimes it doesn't happen that way. Sometimes there's no time to scream. Sometimes all we have left are broken phone calls and a silent car in the snow. By midnight, the urgency in Grand Forks had transformed into something palpable. Fear doesn't need sirens to announce itself. Sometimes it creeps in quietly through unanswered phone calls, an empty bed, a voicemail that goes unheard. Dru Sjodin was missing, and the world around her began to shift. Her father, Alan, raced into town as soon as he heard. When he arrived and saw her abandoned car, the patrol lights blinking across the snowy asphalt, he collapsed beside it. In the darkness, he lit a candle and held a vigil alone, his breath visible in the freezing air, his hope already trembling under the weight of what he feared. Crime scene experts scoured the area. The knife sheath they'd found was unusual, one from a specific kitchen set sold at a chain store. It wasn't some generic item anyone might carry. It was traceable, a clue, a whisper from the perpetrator left in the snow. And yet, there was no blood, no struggle, no broken glass. She was just, well, that's what made it so haunting. There was no chaos, no loud scene, only precision. They traced the calls Dru made that evening. The first, to Chris, clearly came from the mall, but the second 2.5 hours later came from miles away, near Crookston, Minnesota. She had crossed state lines, or rather, someone had taken her there. That changed everything. Now, the case involved not just local police, but state agencies and the FBI. And very quickly, the name Dru Sjodin began echoing beyond North Dakota, across newsrooms, across dinner tables, across the country. An investigator later said, Dru was everyone's daughter. And that may be the most honest explanation for what happened next. When officials asked for volunteers, they expected maybe a few dozen people. 1,300 showed up: students, teachers, families, churchgoers. They came in snow boots and thick coats, carrying flashlights and thermoses of coffee. Buses ran every hour to ferry them to search sites near Fisher, Minnesota. Drones weren't yet part of standard searches. GPS trackers weren't in every pocket. These people searched with their eyes, their hands, and their hearts. There's something raw and beautiful in the way communities respond to tragedy. This wasn't about heroism, it was about humanity. Because Dru was known. She had tutored kids. She'd laughed with friends at campus cafes. She had painted murals and led fundraisers. People remembered her smile, her voice, her kindness. They didn't show up for a headline. They showed up for Dru. Flyers went up everywhere. Her face became a symbol not just of a missing girl, but of something deeply wrong. Emails were sent to every student, faculty member, and UND staffer. Candlelight vigils spilled over church steps. Strangers prayed together in parking lots. The city, the state, the nation held its breath, and still nothing. Her phone continued to ping for several days, triangulated within a 3-mile radius of a cell tower near Fisher. Search parties combed that area tirelessly. Helicopters hovered. Dogs tracked frozen scents. But nature was cruel. Snow and ice covered everything. Days passed. Hope dimmed. You begin to realize something horrible in cases like this. Even the largest search in the world can't beat time in winter. And no number of people, no matter how willing, can erase the fact that they are always one step behind someone who didn't want her found. 4 days after Dru vanished, investigators received a tip. It wasn't the first by then. They'd already chased down over 2,000 leads. But this one felt different. The caller reported seeing a man inside the Columbia Mall at the exact time Dru had finished her shift. Not just any man, a known sex offender. His name, Alfonso Rodriguez Jr. The mention of that name sent a chill through seasoned detectives. Rodriguez was no ordinary ex-convict. He had been classified as a level 3 sex offender, the highest risk category, the kind considered likely to reoffend, the kind who should never have been alone in a shopping mall. But somehow he was. Rodriguez had been released from prison just 6 months earlier, after serving a 23-year sentence. His criminal history was disturbing. In 1974, he'd raped a woman at knife point, then attacked a second woman the same night. Instead of a long prison sentence, he was placed in a psychiatric facility. Within a few years, he was released. And within months, he attacked again, this time trying to kidnap and stab a third woman. She managed to escape and give police a perfect description. So why was he free in 2003? Why was he anywhere near a mall? It's an uncomfortable truth. We rarely confront our system, often calculates risk in paperwork, not in lived consequences. Alfonso Rodriguez had shown the world who he was more than once. Yet here he was, strolling down aisles of CDs at a Target store, as if nothing had happened, as if he was just another man killing time on a Saturday afternoon. And on surveillance footage, he was watching, waiting. Investigators pulled CCTV footage from the Columbia Mall. Despite the grainy resolution, one figure stood out: Rodriguez. He wasn't shopping. He wasn't meeting anyone. He was simply wandering, circling, hovering near the entrance, scanning faces, drifting from store to store with no clear purpose. At 3:45 p.m., he sat on a bench near the exits, gloves in hand, eyes scanning the crowds. 10 minutes later, he stood and began following a blonde woman pushing her cart toward the parking lot. It wasn't Dru, but it didn't matter. He was hunting. Predators rarely lunge without pattern. They study. They observe. They wait for the moment when the world looks away for just 1 second. And in Rodriguez's case, he had waited for years. Now he had opportunity, and no one was watching him. When police confronted him at a construction site near Crookston, eerily close to where one of Dru's shoes had been found, he was cooperative, smiling, calm. He said he had gone to Grand Forks that day to watch a movie and buy clothes. But investigators already knew he had bought nothing, and the film he claimed to have watched, it hadn't even been playing. In his glove compartment, they found multiple knives. In a jar in the back seat, something worse: a particular blade soaked in a cleaning agent. Its shape matched the sheath found near Dru's car. One detective later said, "You could have knocked him over with a feather when we pulled it out." He was stunned, caught, and still he denied everything. For days, Alfonso Rodriguez Jr. maintained his story. He'd been shopping, watching a movie, minded his own business. He claimed he had nothing to hide. He even allowed the police to search his car. That was his mistake. Crime scene technicians moved methodically. In the glove compartment, knives. In the back seat, more blades. Some cleaned, some not. Then they opened a jar filled with a pungent liquid that reeked of bleach and chemicals. In a serrated blade, it matched the sheath found near Dru Sjodin's car. The match wasn't just visual. It was chilling in its specificity. This was the knife, and it had been washed. That detail alone spoke volumes. But it wasn't just about the blade. Further examination revealed something undeniable: bloodstains. Faint, nearly invisible to the naked eye. But they were there on the back seat, the window, the upholstery. The lab confirmed what everyone feared: the blood belonged to Dru. For investigators, it was a moment of grim affirmation. They no longer needed to wonder. Dru hadn't wandered off. She hadn't gotten lost. She had been taken and she had bled. Rodriguez was arrested on December 1st, charged with kidnapping. And though everyone hoped that maybe, just maybe, she was still alive somewhere, that hope was shrinking. Because here's the cruel reality: when a predator is this organized, this careful, and this silent, it rarely ends with survival. And Alfonso Rodriguez Jr. wasn't saying a word. Winter crept deeper into the Midwest. Snow thickened. Roads iced over. Volunteers still searched, wrapped in scarves, trudging through wooded paths, digging through frozen ravines. Dru's family hired a private investigator. Drones flew overhead. Maps were marked and redrawn. And still, nothing. Rodriguez refused to cooperate. His silence was a second crime, a cruelty all its own. Every day he withheld information. Another piece of Dru's dignity was suspended in limbo. Her parents couldn't mourn, couldn't bury, couldn't breathe. Police worked tirelessly, but they were losing to the weather. Sergeant Mike Hedlund of the Grand Forks Police Department later said, "I'd go home, lie in bed, and stare at the ceiling thinking, what haven't we done yet?" That's the quiet horror of investigation, not the car chases or gunfights Hollywood imagines, but the waiting, the knowing, the second guessing. And for a parent, the pain is indescribable. Alan and Linda Sjodin weren't just losing sleep. They were living inside a slow-moving funeral, and behind it all was a man who sat quietly in his cell, refusing to speak. No remorse, no confession, only silence. April 17th, 2004. The call came like a thunderclap. Nearly 5 months had passed since Dru disappeared. 5 months of search parties, false leads, freezing wind, and unbearable silence. 5 months of waking up hoping this would be the day. 5 months of going to sleep terrified that it wouldn't be. But this call was different. Her body had been found. It was a ravine just outside of Crookston, hidden, forgotten, crusted over with thawing snow and early spring mud. A spot quiet enough for nature to reclaim what was left of her. She was naked from the waist down, her hands bound tightly behind her back, a rope cinched around her neck. A plastic bag still partially clung to her face. She had been beaten, stabbed, sexually assaulted. There were deep lacerations across her body. One on her neck was over 5 inches long. The medical examiner couldn't determine exactly what killed her. Was it the blood loss, the strangulation, the cold? The answer was crueler than any single cause, all of it. She had been brutalized, left to suffer, and abandoned in the snow like something disposable. It's hard to write this part. Hard to tell the truth about what was done to Dru. But these facts matter not for shock value, but because sugarcoating cruelty is another kind of silence. And silence is how people like Alfonso Rodriguez Jr. thrive. Her father, Alan, said it best. It was an absolutely horrible day, but it was a day of relief. They had her back, not whole, not alive, but back. There would be a funeral now, a coffin to carry, and 2 men, her boyfriend Chris and her ex-boyfriend Adam, walked beside her one last time, shoulder to shoulder. 2 young men who once loved her, now bound by grief. Because Dru's body had been taken across state lines, the case was federal, and that meant the death penalty was back on the table. North Dakota hadn't seen a federal death penalty case in over a century. But this was different. No one argued that. Rodriguez pled not guilty. His defense argued mental illness, that he wasn't competent, that maybe he didn't even remember what he'd done. But after multiple evaluations, experts agreed he was sane. Sane when he stalked her, sane when he attacked her, sane when he drove with her body in his car, sane when he dumped her like garbage in the woods. In August 2006, a federal jury found Alfonso Rodriguez Jr. guilty of kidnapping resulting in death. He was sentenced to death. And for a moment, just a moment, there was a sense that justice had spoken clearly. But even that wouldn't last. Justice, it turns out, doesn't end with a verdict. After Alfonso Rodriguez Jr. was sentenced to death in 2006, the case should have closed. For most families, a guilty verdict offers a chance to breathe again, to grieve, to begin the long process of healing. But for the Sjodin family, the courtroom was only the beginning of another kind of torment: appeals. Rodriguez's defense team immediately began the process. They filed motions, cited technicalities, questioned the evidence. They combed through trial transcripts looking for missteps, loopholes, anything to keep him alive. And eventually he spoke. In 2011, as part of an appeal, Rodriguez gave a partial confession. He told a psychologist that he had mistaken Dru for a girl who had sexually abused him when he was 6 years old at church camp. He claimed he dissociated, went into a fugue state. He said he didn't know what he was doing, that he blacked out. It was a confession not of guilt, but of excuse. A grotesque attempt to reframe himself not as the predator, but as the victim. What he didn't mention was the knife, the rope, the plastic bag, the body left in a ravine. Rodriguez was trying to rewrite his story, but the evidence had already told the truth, and still his appeals continued. To the Eighth Circuit, to the U.S. Supreme Court. Every time a judge upheld the conviction, there was a moment of breathless relief for Dru's family. But those moments were always followed by new motions, new claims, new strategies. It was as if Rodriguez wasn't trying to escape justice, only to outlast it. In 21, nearly 2 decades after Dru's murder, came the unthinkable. A federal judge overturned Rodriguez's death sentence. Not because he was innocent, not because he hadn't done it, but because of errors in the trial, misleading testimony from a coroner, failures by defense attorneys, and evidence suggesting severe post-traumatic stress disorder that hadn't been fully considered. In other words, it wasn't what he did that saved him from death. It was how his trial had been conducted. For the Sjodin family, it was a punch to the soul. Bob Heels, the family's longtime private investigator, said it best: "This case is an extreme example of why we have the death penalty. If you're not going to use it in a case like this, when are you ever going to?" He spoke for many, for people who had followed the case for years, for those who had walked through the snow with search teams, for strangers who had cried when Dru's body was found. Rodriguez would no longer face execution. He would live the rest of his life in prison. To some, that was enough. But to many others, it felt like a final insult, because justice delayed isn't always justice preserved. Sometimes it's just pain prolonged. It's been more than 20 years since Dru Sjodin vanished into a cold November night, but her name still echoes through classrooms, courtrooms, and the quiet corners of Grand Forks where her memory lives on. On campus at the University of North Dakota, professors still speak her name. In high schools across the Midwest, teachers mention her case when talking about safety, resilience, and what it means to look out for one another. And remarkably, 2 decades later, kids who weren't even born when she died still raise their hands when asked, "Have you heard of Dru Sjodin?" Her story became more than a crime. It became a cause. After her death, Dru's family channeled their grief into action. Her mother, Linda Walker, kept a promise she made at her daughter's funeral to speak when she didn't want to speak, to attend court hearings she wished never existed, to fight, again and again, for victims' rights. In 2006, then-President George W. Bush signed it into law, the Dru Sjodin National Sex Offender Public Website, a centralized, searchable registry that gives the public access to sex offender information nationwide. It was a legislative victory built on unimaginable loss, but it meant something. Her name is now part of federal law. A scholarship was created in her honor supporting young women at UND who embody Dru's kindness, ambition, and compassion. A sculpture of a tree, modeled after one of her childhood drawings, marks her grave. And in Grand Forks, There's a small memorial garden, quiet, peaceful, full of light, but perhaps most haunting, most human, is what her parents still hold on to. Her father, Alan, keeps her voicemails saved. He listens to them sometimes not to relive the pain, but to remember the sound of her voice, the real her, before the headlines, before the horror. Linda, her mother, once said, "What we need to remember isn't the man who did this. What we need to remember is Dru." And she's right. It's easy to let a story like this be defined by its darkness. But Dru Sjodin wasn't darkness. She was color and movement and kindness and strength. She was laughter in dorm rooms and patience in classrooms and creativity poured into paper and pixels. She was someone who saw the best in others. And in the end, she deserves so much more than what the world gave her. We often think of true crime as mystery, as puzzle, but this wasn't a mystery. It was a tragedy. A girl taken in broad daylight, a predator hiding in plain sight, a justice system that moved too slowly, then tried to correct itself too late. But it was also a story of resilience, of a community that refused to look away, of thousands who marched through snow, not because they had to, but because they couldn't imagine not trying. Dru's light was stolen, but her legacy wasn't. And maybe, just maybe, that's how we fight back against cruelty. Not just with punishment, but with memory, with action, with love. Because while evil tried to erase Dru Sjodin, it failed.